Harry Potter is a feel-good story, but at its core, it also focuses on loss, war, and tragedy. It's no secret that a lot of people die in Harry Potter, but before making this video, I had no idea just how many deaths there were. There are a whopping 104 deaths, and I'm gonna go through each one, explaining who they are and how they died. Before we go any further, spoiler alert. There are going to be so many spoilers for the entire series, so you've been warned. I'm going to structure this video as sort of a timeline and put the deaths in order based on when they happened, and we'll start in the year 1000 and go to the year 1998 when the series ended. I feel it's important for me to say that I will be basing this on the books, not the films. There are many differences between the two, especially for many of these death scenes. Now let's get into it and go over every single person that died in Harry Potter. Starting in the year 1000, we have Helena Ravenclaw. She's the daughter of Rowena Ravenclaw, one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts. Leading to her death, her dying mother sent a man named the Baron to retrieve her because Rowena wanted to say goodbye to Helena before she passed away. However, when Helena refused to go with the Baron got angry and stabbed her, and she died moments later. This brings us to the next death, the Baron, or the Bloody Baron. After killing Helena, the woman he was in love with, he could not live with himself, so he took his knife and stabbed himself as well. Interestingly, for both of these characters, death was not the end for them because both had opted to become ghosts, meaning instead of dying, they took their ghostly form and both lived out their ghostly days at Hogwarts. The next person to die was Rowena Ravenclaw, who, as I said, was already on her deathbed when she sent the Baron to retrieve Helena. She never got to see her daughter and died shortly after that. Helga Hufflepuff, Salazar Slytherin, and Godric Gryffindor, the other 3 people who founded Hogwarts, all died after Rowena, and they all died of natural causes. Next, we have the Peverell brothers, the 3 wizards that acquired the Deathly Hallows. Antioch Peverell died first. After bragging of his unbeatable wand that was dubbed the Elder Wand, he was killed in his sleep by someone he had challenged. And after slitting Antioch's throat, the killer took the unbeatable wand with him. Before we get to the second brother, we must first go over the death of Cadmus Peverell's fiancée, who died an untimely death before being able to marry Cadmus. Then Cadmus brought her back with the second Deathly Hallow, the Resurrection Stone. However, when he realized he could not touch the woman he loved, he was driven mad with hopeless longing, so he hung himself to join her in the afterlife. The third brother, who was named Ignotus Peverell, died on his own terms. After many years of hiding from death using the third Deathly Hallow, the Invisibility Cloak, he greeted death as an old friend and went with him gladly. Next, we have Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington, or as most Harry Potter fans know him, Nearly Headless Nick. He tried to use magic to straighten a Muggle woman's crooked teeth, but his attempt failed, and instead she grew a tusk. Nick was immediately taken into custody and was sentenced to death as a result of his mistake. However, the executioner's axe was not sharpened well, and thus it took 45 hacks to kill Nick, and even then, his head was only partially severed, hence his nickname Nearly Headless Nick. Like Helena and the Baron, he opted to be a ghost following his death, and he too lived out his ghostly days at Hogwarts. Sticking with the ghostly characters, next we have Professor Cuthbert Binns. He was the history of magic teacher at Hogwarts, and like his boring lectures and personality, he might have the most boring death in the series. One day he fell asleep in front of the fire in the staff room, and he died in his sleep. Then, when he got up to teach his next class, he was a ghost. He did not seem to notice, however, and went on to keep teaching history of magic at Hogwarts for hundreds of years after his death. Percival Dumbledore is the next person in the series that died, and this is a good 200 years after the previous characters. Percival Dumbledore is the father of Albus Dumbledore, and he died in Azkaban prison. With his death actually comes 3 more on top of that, because he was sentenced to life in prison for killing 3 Muggle boys who assaulted and did some other terrible things to his daughter Ariana. Not long after that, Kendra Dumbledore, Percival's wife, died in a terrible accident that involved the Obscurus inside Ariana. If you've seen Fantastic Beasts, you know that an Obscurial can be very dangerous, and one day, Ariana's emotions and her magic spun out of control, and this caused an explosion that took Kendra Dumbledore's life. Ariana Dumbledore was the next character to go, and this was in the middle of a heated battle between her 2 brothers, Albus and Aberforth, along with Albus's friend Gellert Grindelwald. Ariana, unable to control her magic, tried to stop the fight, and she was inadvertently killed. It was never known which of the 3 wizards was directly responsible for her death, but Albus and Aberforth carried that guilt to their grave. About 26 years later, we have our next death. Rubeus Hagrid's father, or Mr. Hagrid, died at a pretty young age sometime during his son's 2nd year at Hogwarts, and this meant he never saw his son get expelled, which Hagrid was secretly glad about, though he was still devastated to lose his father, as he was the only family he really had. Next on the list is Marvolo Gaunt, who was the grandfather of Lord Voldemort. Marvolo Gaunt was sent to Azkaban after trying to fight off a load of Ministry employees at his house as he was defending his son Morphin, who the Ministry was after because Morphin had attacked a Muggle using magic. He and his son of course lost and were taken into custody. Marvolo got the lesser punishment, meaning he was freed after just 6 months. When he came home, he was expecting his daughter Merope to be waiting for his return with a hot meal and ready to do his bidding. But he was in for a shock when he found out that she was not only gone, but had stolen his 2 most prized possessions, his Gaunt family ring and Slytherin's locket. And on top of that, he discovered that she had married a Muggle and was pregnant with the Muggle's baby, something that did not sit well with the Muggle-hating, pureblood-obsessed Marvolo. Marvolo's shock was so great that he never mentioned his daughter's name or existence again, and the shock of his daughter's desertion was so great that it led to his early demise. And speaking of Marvolo's daughter, Merope Gaunt was the next to lose her life. She was of course the mother of Tom Riddle, aka Lord Voldemort, and she died while giving birth to Tom in the orphanage where he would grow up. The cause of death? A broken heart, after Tom's father, Tom Riddle Sr., the Muggle that I just mentioned, left her. Though he had good reason to leave her, because Merope had him under a love potion, and when she eventually stopped giving it to him, he came to his senses and left. Myrtle Warren was the next character to die. She was a student at Hogwarts and was the first victim of Lord Voldemort. Voldemort had some help with this one though, because the thing that actually killed Myrtle was looking the basilisk from the Chamber of Secrets in the eyes. She instantly died in the girls' bathroom, and she decided to stay in that bathroom when she became a ghost, and she became known as Moaning Myrtle. Tom Riddle Sr. along with his parents were the next 3 victims of Lord Voldemort. Thinking that his father had abandoned him and his mother because she was a witch, Voldemort broke into the mansion and killed his father and his paternal grandparents. Their corpses were described as having a look of terror upon their faces, and this baffled Muggle police and sparked many rumors in the small town that they lived in. And sticking to Voldemort's family, Morphin Gaunt, Voldemort's uncle, was the next person to die. After completing his Azkaban sentence for the standoff against the Ministry workers, Morphin went back to his old house, and here Voldemort arrived, stunned his uncle, committed the murder of his father and grandparents that I just mentioned, and then came back to Morphin and modified his memory to make Morphin think that he had killed Tom Riddle Sr. as well as his parents. Voldemort did such a good job modifying his memory that Morphin bragged of his murder, meaning there was no investigation because they thought they had their man, and Morphin was once again locked up in Azkaban, where he eventually died. Hepzibah Smith was the next person to lose her life, and again, she was a victim of Lord Voldemort. Hepzibah was taken by the young, handsome, and charming Tom Riddle, and she showed him her 2 most prized possessions, Hufflepuff's cup and Slytherin's locket. After seeing these relics, Voldemort wanted these items for himself, so he came back a few days later, killed Hepzibah, and stole the 2 relics. Going forward about 30 years, Regulus Black was the next character to lose his life. Regulus was a Death Eater, one of Voldemort's followers, but he soon regretted this path. During his time as a Death Eater, Regulus was actually the first person to figure out that Voldemort had made a Horcrux, and to redeem himself, he used his house elf creature to learn how Voldemort hid that Horcrux. He then had creature take him to that very cave where the Horcrux was, and unfortunately, Voldemort's defenses worked, as Inferi that Voldemort had placed in the water dragged Regulus to his death, but not before Regulus ordered creature to leave with the locket and destroy it. For years, no one ever knew of Regulus' sacrifice, not even his own brother Sirius, who thought his brother was unceremoniously killed on Voldemort's orders, not even important enough for Voldemort himself to take care of him. The time period that we have now reached is when the First Wizarding War took place, and this led to many deaths. Next, we have Dean Thomas's father. Now, this is an interesting one, because this story never showed up in the books and was left on the cutting room floor, but Rowling later expanded on it in 2004. She explained that Dean's father was a wizard who never told his wife what he was. To his wife, and later to Dean, it appeared that he had abandoned the two of them, but in actuality, Dean's father had left to protect his family from the Death Eaters. It was good that he did this too, because the Death Eaters eventually caught up with him and killed him when he refused to join them, and it is very likely that if Dean's father had not left, Dean and his mother would have been killed as well. Going over more victims of the war, we have Edgar Bones, a member of the Order of the Phoenix who was killed by Death Eaters, and even more tragically, his innocent wife and 2 kids were murdered by the Death Eaters as well. The same fate happened to another Order member named Marlene McKinnon, and she too was taken down alongside her husband and 2 kids. Another Order member named Dorcas Meadows was also killed in the heat of battle by Voldemort himself. There was also Order member named Benji Fenwick, who was not only killed, but mutilated by Death Eaters. 2 more Order members to lose their lives who might hit a little closer to home are Fabian and Gideon Pruitt, who were Molly Weasley's brothers. The brothers were attacked by 5 Death Eaters, and while fighting 2 on 5, they fought and died like heroes according to fellow Order member Mad-Eye Moody. Perhaps the 2 most meaningful deaths in the series are James and Lily Potter. Not only did their deaths set the entire series up for the boy who lived, but their deaths ended the First Wizarding War. Voldemort heard part of a prophecy that basically told him to kill either Harry Potter or Neville Longbottom, and he chose Harry. Though James and Lily put security measures in place, their friend Peter Pettigrew betrayed them, allowing Voldemort to come to their house where they were not ready for an attack. James's wand was on the couch across the room, and he shouted, telling Lily to take Harry and run while he held Voldemort off. Voldemort made short work of the wandless James and hit him with the killing curse. He then made his way to Lily and Harry. Lily jumped in front of her son as Voldemort killed her, and this act of sacrificing herself placed a protection on Harry that would last for many years and caused Voldemort to almost die when he tried to kill Harry that night. Though the First Wizarding War was over, the Ministry set out to capture the remaining Death Eaters, and this included Evan Rosier and another Death Eater named Wilkes. The Death Eaters were pursued and killed in battle by a group of Aurors, including Mad-Eye Moody. Evan Rosier went down with the fight though, as he managed to blast off a significant part of Moody's nose before Mad-Eye finished him off. The next 12 deaths are not named, and the characters are not relevant to the plot, but their deaths are very relevant to one character arc, which is why I added them. Sirius Black went after Peter Pettigrew for betraying James and Lily, and Pettigrew managed to kill 12 Muggles in the area and escape, framing Sirius for the Muggles' deaths. These 12 deaths are so important because they literally ruined an innocent man's life. Sirius was locked up for 12 years in Azkaban, and even when he was freed, these 12 deaths still forced him to stay in hiding, and this absolutely destroyed his spirit and changed Sirius for the worse. The next death is one of the more tragic ones. Barty Crouch Jr.'s mother, or Mrs. Crouch. Her husband Barty Sr. had locked their son Barty Jr. in Azkaban for a crime that Mrs. Crouch did not believe their son was guilty of, and this incident made her health deteriorate drastically from stress. In the last few weeks of her life, Mrs. Crouch convinced her husband to allow her to trade places with their son. When they entered Azkaban to visit him, both Mrs. Crouch and Barty Crouch Jr. drank Polyjuice Potion to take on each other's appearances. Mrs. Crouch stayed in Azkaban while her son left with her husband, and she died in prison shortly after, making sure she drank the potion so that everyone would think that her son passed away. Barty Crouch Sr. then staged her death to the public and had a private funeral for his wife with an empty grave. Bilious Weasley was the next character to die. He was Ron's uncle, and after seeing the Grim, which is the death omen, he died 24 hours later. It wasn't specified how he died, but Hermione pointed out that the Grim was not real, and that wizards who think they see the omen die of fright, basically meaning that the Grim isn't an omen, but rather the cause of death. The next character to lose their life was Pandora Lovegood, Luna Lovegood's mother. Pandora liked to experiment with spells, and one day, one of these experiments went wrong, tragically ending her life in a horrible manner right in front of Luna. Because Luna witnessed her mother's death, she was able to see Thestrals. Now we get into the time period that the 7 books took place in. This starts with Quirrell Quirrell, the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher for Harry's first year at Hogwarts, and the man that allowed Voldemort to latch onto his body. Now, his death in the books was different than what happened in the films. In the books, he did not fall away like he was made of stone. His body remained fully together. Instead, he was terribly burned and blistered from Harry's touch, a result of Lily Potter's death and protection, which I mentioned earlier. Lily's sacrifice ensured that Voldemort could not touch her son without being hurt, and because Quirrell was linked with Voldemort, as he was actually made one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, Quirrell's body could not touch Harry without serious harm either. His death in the book might actually be worse than what happened in the film, where he basically fell apart and died right away, because in the book, he was not put out of his misery. Quirrell's body was burnt so horribly that Voldemort disposed of his body and left him to die in agony. The next death in the series is Armando Dippet, who was the headmaster of Hogwarts before Albus Dumbledore. He was the head of Hogwarts from the 1940s to the 1960s, and after retiring, he died about 30 years later of old age. Next we have Bertha Jorkins, who was a ministry worker. When she went on holiday in Albania, she ran into Peter Pettigrew, and he persuaded her to take a stroll with him into the woods. Here he overpowered Bertha and brought her before a very weakened, but a very much alive Lord Voldemort. Voldemort tortured her and got information out of her, which included the fact that Voldemort's follower Barty Crouch Jr. was still alive, that the Triwizard Tournament was happening that year at Hogwarts, and that Mad-Eye Moody was going to be the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher that year. Voldemort used the information that he had gotten out of Bertha to form his plan of returning to a full body. Bertha's body and mind took a serious toll between the torturing and Voldemort invading her mind with magic. It was damaged beyond repair, so Voldemort murdered her and used her death to make his Horcrux inside of Nagini. Frank Bryce died not long after Bertha Jorkins. He was the Muggle gardener for the Riddles Mansion for most of his life. He was actually arrested for the deaths of Voldemort's father and grandparents, but when the autopsy came back, they realized that he was innocent because there was no evidence of murder at all, which unbeknownst to the Muggles was because they died from the killing curse. Even after being cleared, the whole town still thought he was guilty though, and they gave him hell. One night, he saw a light on in the mansion, and he thought it was kids camping out there and toying with him as always. But when he got up there, he discovered Lord Voldemort, and Voldemort killed him in the same house and using the same spell that he used to kill his father and grandparents. Next, we have Barty Crouch Sr. We discussed him earlier. He's the husband of Mrs. Crouch and the father of Barty Jr., his son who he locked up but then helped break out of Azkaban. Years later, Voldemort and Pettigrew put Crouch Sr. under the Imperius Curse while breaking Barty Jr. out of Crouch Sr.'s grasp. Crouch Sr.'s son served Voldemort and took on the persona of Mad-Eye Moody that year and taught at Hogwarts, which was all part of Voldemort's plan. Crouch Sr. eventually began to fight the Imperius Curse, however, and he made his way to Hogwarts, saying he had to talk to Dumbledore. Barty Jr., who was still at Hogwarts disguised as Mad-Eye, took matters into his own hand, and he killed his father. He left Crouch Sr.'s body in the Forbidden Forest, but later came back and transfigured his father's body into a bone, and buried that bone in front of Hagrid's hut. Next, we have one of the most shocking deaths in the series, and that is the death of Cedric Diggory. He was a Hufflepuff student at Hogwarts, and he competed in the Triwizard Tournament. He got wrapped up in Voldemort's plan when he touched the cup alongside Harry, which Barty Jr. had turned into a portkey that took them to the graveyard outside the Riddle Mansion. Voldemort had no use for Cedric, so he told Pettigrew to kill the spare, and Pettigrew obliged, using the killing curse. Cedric was later mourned by his parents and everyone else at Hogwarts, both students and staff, and his death took a serious toll on Harry, who witnessed the murder and had nightmares about it constantly. Next, we have a death that many might forget, Carcus. Carcus was a giant who lived in the mountains, and he was the giants' leader. He bossed the giants around and forced them to feed himself and his wife. At the start of the Second Wizarding War, following Voldemort's return to a full body, Hagrid and Maxime, both of whom were half giants, approached Carcus on Dumbledore's orders to try and recruit the giants to their side. Carcus enjoyed the gifts that Hagrid and Maxime brought him, and he was very close to siding with them. But that night, another giant challenged Carcus for the top position, and the two fought a vicious battle. The fight went on for hours, and in the end, Carcus was killed when the other giant ripped his head off and threw it at the bottom of a lake. Next, we have Broderick Bode. Bode was an employee of the Ministry of Magic who worked in the Department of Mysteries, the place where prophecies were housed, including the prophecy about Harry and Voldemort was desperate to get his hands on this. To do so, he had Lucius Malfoy place Bode under the Imperius Curse to steal the prophecy. However, because a prophecy can only be obtained by those about whom they are made, as soon as Bode touched the orb, the defensive spells around it were triggered, and Bode suffered spell damage that affected his mind. He was taken to St. Mungo's Hospital for treatment, and he was admitted to the spell damage ward. Most of the time, he sat there in comatose, and when he was awake, all he did was mumble and stare at the ceiling. Eventually, however, a miracle happened, and Bode's condition got better and better. Upon learning this, the Death Eaters knew they had to silence him, so they sent an anonymous Christmas present, which was a potted plant that was really Devil's Snare, and when Bode touched it, the plant killed him instantly. The next death is a big one, Sirius Black. Sirius was of course Harry's godfather, and when he got word that Harry and his friends were in the Ministry, he and a handful of other Order members rushed to save them. While there, Sirius dueled his cousin Bellatrix Lestrange, and while laughing at her and egging her on, Bellatrix fired a spell that hit Sirius square in the chest. As he fell back, the laughter still etched on his face, his body curved in a graceful arc and he sank backwards through the veil, his body disappearing and never coming back. At this point in time, the Second Wizarding War was in full swing. Voldemort had just revealed himself to the public, and there was death everywhere. Amelia Bones was one victim of this war. She was the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and she often talked down on Voldemort very publicly. Realizing that she was a very skilled witch and a pretty admirable enemy, Voldemort did not send his Death Eaters after her, but rather took her murder into his own hands. When he confronted her, Amelia did not go down without a fight, as there was evidence that it took a great effort for Voldemort to kill her. After her death, many members of the Order of the Phoenix referred to her as one of the greatest witches of her time, and said that her absence would be felt by many. This war also took Emmeline Vance, who was a member of the Order of the Phoenix for both the First and Second Wizarding War, and she was also among the advance guard who escorted Harry from his aunt and uncle's house to the Order's headquarters. One day, however, she was murdered by Death Eaters near the residence of the Muggle Prime Minister, and some believe that she was watching and making sure that the Prime Minister was safe. One lesser known but more tragic death was Florian Fortescue, the owner of Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor in Diagon Alley. He actually gave Harry free ice cream when he was staying in the Leaky Cauldron before his 3rd year, and he even helped Harry complete his History of Magic homework. He was a very kind man, and he did not deserve what happened to him. He was forcibly dragged away by Death Eaters, leaving his ice cream parlor a mess. Rowling later revealed that he had information on the Elder Wand and the Lost Diadem, which is why he was kidnapped, and after Voldemort was done with him, he killed Fortescue. Next we have Igor Karkaroff. He was a former Death Eater, but when Voldemort fell at the end of the First Wizarding War, he gave the Ministry loads of names of those he knew to be loyal to the Dark Lord, which guaranteed his early freedom from Azkaban. He then became the headmaster of Durmstrang, but when Voldemort returned and Karkaroff felt the dark mark on his arm, meaning Voldemort was calling him, he fled. He was on the run for a year, but eventually he was tracked down to a shack in the north and killed by Death Eaters for his betrayal. Next is a rather minor death, but a death nonetheless. Mrs. Abbott, Hannah Abbott's mother, was found dead in her home, murdered by Death Eaters. When Hannah was informed of her mother's death, she was pulled out of her biology class while at Hogwarts. Mrs. Abbott's death is made more important to the story because Rowling later revealed that Hannah Abbott would go on to marry Neville Longbottom in the future, meaning Neville never got to meet his mother-in-law. Another more minor but very tragic death was that of the 5-year-old Montgomery boy. He was the younger brother of the Montgomery sisters who were students at Hogwarts. After their mother refused to aid the Death Eaters, they had werewolf Fenrir Greyback attack the 5-year-old boy. Instead of simply turning the boy into a werewolf, Greyback got carried away and injured him very badly. After being rushed to St. Mungo's Hospital, the 5-year-old Montgomery boy died from his injuries not long after being admitted. Next is Aragog. Aragog was of course the Acromantula that was Hagrid's pet and who lived in the Forbidden Forest. He died of old age.
Farewell, Aragog, king of the arachnids.
Octavius Pepper was another victim of this war, and he was kidnapped and killed by Death Eaters. The Death Eater named Gibbon was the next character to lose his life. He fought in the Battle of the Astronomy Tower and was one of the Death Eaters that Draco Malfoy led into the school. In the book, he was the one who set the dark mark in the sky, and this was actually done before Dumbledore's death, unlike in the movie, and the mark that Gibbon cast was used to make Dumbledore think someone in the school had died while he was in Hogsmeade, which was what the dark mark was normally used to indicate. Gibbon's job was to wait at the astronomy tower while everyone else fought below, but Gibbon did not like the idea of staying there and waiting for the powerful Albus Dumbledore by himself, so he ran downstairs to join the battle. Here he was killed by a stray killing curse cast by fellow Death Eater Thorfinn Rao that was actually intended for Remus Lupin. Next is one of the most well-known deaths in the history of fiction, Albus Dumbledore. He was killed by Snape, But rewinding a bit, he had actually poisoned himself a year earlier when he put on the Gaunt Ring, which was one of Voldemort's Horcruxes. Snape was able to contain the poison to just his hand, but Snape told Dumbledore that he only had a year to live. Knowing this, Dumbledore told Snape that he had to kill him for 2 reasons. One, so that Draco Malfoy, the boy that Voldemort had tasked to do so, would not have to do it. And 2, so that Voldemort would fully trust Snape, who was actually loyal to Dumbledore all along. Dumbledore's death was a heavy loss for everybody, especially the Order of the Phoenix, and his funeral held some of the most well-known and respected witches and wizards, as well as many of the creatures from the Hogwarts grounds, and on that day, everybody honored him. Charity Burbage was the next character to lose their life. She was the Muggle Studies professor at Hogwarts. Following Dumbledore's death, however, Snape became headmaster and served Voldemort under Dumbledore's orders, and one of the hardest things Snape had to do was allow Charity Burbage to be abducted by Voldemort, tortured by him, and eventually killed by him.
Severus, please. We're friends.
And to make it even worse, after Voldemort killed her, he fed her corpse to a snake, Nagini. Her life was taken all because Voldemort did not like the way she glorified muggles in her class, an innocent woman getting a horrible fate that she did not deserve. The next death that breaks every Harry Potter fan's heart is Hedwig. She was of course Harry's first friend in the Wizarding World besides Hagrid, and she was there with him through every step of his journey, always a loving companion. Her death in the books was a bit different than her death in the movies. In the books, she was not let out to fly freely during the Battle of the Seven Potters. She was actually in her cage at Harry's feet while riding in Hagrid's motorbike, and while flying, a killing curse that was aimed for Harry ended up hitting her, and her body fell like a rag doll to the bottom of the cage. To make things worse, Harry was then forced to destroy the sidecar containing Hedwig's body in an effort to slow down the pursuing Death Eaters. Afterwards, Hagrid consoled Harry, saying that Hedwig had lived a great old life. Another person to lose their life during the Battle of Seven Potters was Alistair Mad-Eye Moody. He and Mundungus Fletcher flew together, Mundungus disguised as Harry, and Voldemort thinking that Harry would be with the most skilled wizard, he pursued Mad-Eye and Mundungus. Mundungus took one look at the flying Voldemort and disapparated, making the killing curse that Voldemort had shot at Mundungus hit Mad-Eye instead, and it killed him instantly, making his body fall off the broom and fall to the ground. His body was later recovered by Death Eaters, and his magical eye was given to Dolores Umbridge. Harry later stole the eye while breaking into the Ministry, however, and he buried the eye in the woods, giving Mad-Eye a proper send-off. Rufus Scrimgeour was an unsung hero that many people forget about. He was the Minister of Magic who replaced Cornelius Fudge, and he and Harry did not see eye to eye on many things, which led to a few uncomfortable arguments between the two. Despite this though, when Voldemort infiltrated the Ministry, he captured and brutally tortured Scrimgeour, trying to get the Minister to tell him Harry's whereabouts, and despite knowing, in his final moments he put up quite a fight and refused to talk, protecting Harry through and through. Upon finding this out, Harry gained a tremendous amount of respect for Scrimgeour, and he was very grateful to the late minister. The next person to lose their life was McCoo Gregorovitch, who was a wand maker and the biggest competition of Ollivander. He was the owner of the Elder Wand for many years until he had it stolen from him by Gellert Grindelwald, and when Voldemort began looking for the unbeatable wand, Ollivander sent him to Gregorovitch, who he had heard had it last. Voldemort hunted Gregorovitch down, and when he found him, he was enraged to find out that Gregorovitch did not have the Elder Wand. Voldemort then used Legilimency to go inside Gregorovitch's mind and find the memory of the night that he had had it stolen from him. After getting this information, he ignored the Wandmaker's pleas for mercy and used the killing curse to end Gregorovitch's life. Bathilda Bagshot is next on the list. She was one of the most celebrated historians to ever live, and was the author of A History of Magic. She lived in Godric's Hollow and was friends with many notable wizards, including the entire Dumbledore family as well as Harry's parents James and Lily. She was eventually murdered in her own home, however. She was killed through the dark arts, and her body was animated by Lord Voldemort, which he achieved through a snake Nagini that housed a part of his soul because of his Horcrux. He used Bathilda, knowing that Harry might come to Godric's Hollow to see his parents' grave. And when Harry did come, Nagini shed Bathilda's body and went after Harry and Hermione. They escaped, however, and Nagini left Bathilda's body in her home, and she was discovered dead a few days later. The The next person to die was Gellert Grindelwald, who because of the Fantastic Beasts movies has been put in the spotlight a lot more. He's the tyrant who ruled before Voldemort, and who was taken down by his former friend and possibly lover, Albus Dumbledore, in what was called the most legendary duel in history. His arc ends much differently in the book than it does in the film, however. In the film, he gives up Dumbledore and tells Voldemort that the Elder Wand lies with Dumbledore in his tomb. In the book, however, Gellert Grindelwald's time locked up made him see the error of his ways, and in his final act, he has his redemption. He refused to tell Voldemort where the Elder Wand was, protecting his former friend and possibly lover Albus. This made Voldemort angry, however, and he killed the now redeemed Gellert Grindelwald with the Killing Curse. Next we have Ted Tonks, Dirk Cresswell, and Gornuk. Ted Tonks is the father of Nymphadora Tonks. Dirk Cresswell was high up in the ministry as the head of the Goblin Liaison Office, and Gornuk was a goblin who worked at Gringotts. After Voldemort took over the ministry, pretty much all Muggleborns were forced to go on the run, including Ted and Dirk, and goblins were not safe either, so Gornuk made a run for it as well. Eventually, the three of them, along with Griphook and Dean Thomas, came together to form a group and travel together while in hiding. A group of Snatchers eventually found them, however, and when Ted, Dirk, and Gornuk resisted capture, they were killed. Peter Pettigrew was the next character to fall, and once again, his arc ended much differently in the movies than it did in the book. In the movie, he was just comically stupefied, but in the book, his arc ended in a much more serious and intense way. When Pettigrew goes down to check on the captured Harry and Ron, the two boys manage to wrestle his wand from him, but Pettigrew then began to choke Harry with the strong silver replacement hand that Voldemort gave to him. However, Harry then reminded Pettigrew that he saved his life, referring to the time that he stopped Sirius and Lupin from taking his life in the Shrieking Shack 4 years earlier. In response to this, Pettigrew's eyes filled with terror, and his metal hand reached for his own throat, and he began to strangle himself. Harry and Ron tried to stop him, but Pettigrew was too strong. His face turned purple, his eyes began to roll back, and after giving one more twitch, he was still. Dobby the House Elf was the next character to lose their life, and he died when he went to save Harry and company from Malfoy Manor, something that was quite meaningful because Dobby used to serve the Malfoy family in that very house. As they disapparated, Bellatrix threw her knife, and the blade managed to stab Dobby in the stomach. When they arrived on the beach, Harry held Dobby as he spoke his final words.
Dobby is happy to be with his friend, Harry Potter.
Harry buried Dobby, making his tombstone say, "Here lies Dobby, a free elf." The next 3 deaths were not mentioned in the books, but were in the films. And I know I said I'm basing this video on the books, not the films, but I'm adding these because Rowling said that she approved of these deaths despite not being in the novels.
Please just still got Bogrod.
Bogrod was the goblin that Harry put under the Imperius Curse as they broke into Gringotts. Being dazed due to the Imperius Curse, he stood within the security dragon's reach and was subsequently burned to death by a jet of fire that the dragon shot out.
That's unfortunate.
When Voldemort discovered the theft of his Horcrux from Bellatrix's vault, he went on a rampage killing everyone within reach, and in the film, this included Griphook, who was the goblin that let Harry into his vault the first time he entered Gringotts, and the goblin who had just betrayed Harry and taken the Sword of Gryffindor while leaving the trio for dead. And the third person that I'll add from the movie is Scrimgeour, the Snatcher that took center stage in Deathly Hallows Part 1 and 2. In the film, he was killed in the Battle of Hogwarts when Neville and a few other DA members blew up the bridge. Going back to book canon, we have Vincent Crabbe. Due to some legal troubles with the actor that played Crabbe, in the film, they had to give his death scene to Goyle instead, but in the book, it was Crabbe that fell into the fiend fire that he himself had created and lost control of. The next death is probably the most heartbreaking of them all. Fred Weasley.
You okay, Freddy? Yeah. Me too.
As he was joking around with Percy, who he had just made up with, the wall next to them exploded. The explosion was closest to Fred, and it killed him instantly, the ghost of his last laugh still etched upon his face. Death Eater Augustus Rookwood was the person responsible for the explosion. The Weasley family mourned Fred's death, and though the good guys won the fight, the Weasleys did not feel as though they had won. During the battle, Remus Lupin fought a Death Eater named Antonin Dolohov, but Lupin was no longer in prime fighting condition, as he had spent the last few months doing nothing but protective and concealment charms to ensure the safety of his wife Tonks and their newborn baby named Teddy. Because of this, Dolohov got the upper hand and took Remus's life. Tragically, Nymphadora Tonks also died that night, meaning their baby Teddy would grow up an orphan. Tonks lost her life while fighting her aunt, Bellatrix Lestrange. It was the third time the two had dueled, and this time, Bellatrix did not hold back as she killed her niece. Lupin and Tonks' bodies were laying down next to each other, because even in death, they were still together. Lavender Brown was another victim of this brutal battle. She was taken down by Fenrir Greyback, who sunk his teeth into her neck. She was able to get up for a second, but she later died from her injuries. Colin Creevey also lost his life during the Battle of Hogwarts. He was not supposed to be there because he wasn't of age yet, but he snuck out to join the fight anyway. He ran out on the Hogwarts grounds, putting up a fight, but someone eventually got the better of him and ended his life far too early. Later on, Neville Longbottom and Oliver Wood recovered his lifeless body and brought it to the Great Hall with all of the other fallen heroes. Perhaps the most complicated death was that of Severus Snape. As I said earlier, Snape was on Dumbledore's side and was playing Voldemort for a fool for a number of years. During the Battle of Hogwarts though, Voldemort realized that Snape was the true master of the Elder Wand because he killed Dumbledore, the former master of the wand. Though this was actually incorrect, which I'll talk about later. But to become the wand's true master, Voldemort released his snake Nagini on Snape, and she wrapped around him, making Snape lose color in his face. Voldemort then gave Nagini the order to kill, and she pounced on him several times. When Voldemort left, Harry entered, and Snape gave him tears that contained all the memories that Harry needed to know. He then looked into Harry's eyes, the eyes that he had inherited from his mother, the woman that Snape loved.
You have your mother's eyes.
And this comforting thought of Lily Potter was the last thing Snape thought of before he died. Now I know that technically Harry died, but because he came back from death and was alive afterwards, I did not add it to this video. I wanted only people that died and stayed dead. At the end of the battle, Nagini was the next person to lose her life, and now with the Fantastic Beasts movies, this death is a lot more meaningful because we know that she used to be a real person that was cursed with the condition of being a maledictus. The timeline of when she was killed in the books versus the movies differs a bit. In the book, she was not killed during Harry and Voldemort's final fight, but rather when Neville stepped forward with the Sword of Gryffindor after his speech. As soon as he pulled the Sword of Gryffindor out, he charged at Nagini and cut her in half, destroying Voldemort's final Horcrux. Bellatrix Lestrange, Voldemort's most loyal follower, was the next to fall. After nearly killing Ginny, Mrs. Weasley stepped forward and challenged Bellatrix, fueled by her despair of losing her son Fred. Bellatrix taunted Mrs. Weasley as they dueled, even bringing up Fred's death. But as Bellatrix laughed, Molly shot back and hit Bellatrix square in the chest right over her heart, killing Bellatrix once and for all. And finally, Lord Voldemort, the man responsible for so many deaths on this list. Voldemort died because he was not the true owner of the Elder Wand. The true owner was actually the person he was fighting, Harry Potter himself. The wand refused to kill its true master, and it flew in the air and landed in Harry's hand. Voldemort fell to the ground, having been killed by his own rebounded curse. He did not fall apart the way he did in the film though. His body simply collapsed, just an ordinary death for an ordinary man who tried so hard to be extraordinary, but failed. And there we are, all 104 deaths in the Harry Potter series. We've gone over many innocent people who did not deserve death, and we've gone over a few that probably did deserve their ultimate fate. Either way, these characters are real to us Harry Potter fans, and going over all of their deaths, whether good or bad, was a really interesting way to look at this wonderful series. Thank you so much for watching, guys. You can follow me on social media to see more of my personal life and more of this little dude. If you like this video, hit that like button and subscribe. I want to give a huge shout out to all my patrons listed below. If you want to be featured on the next video, plus get a bunch of other rewards, become a patron today. Again, thank you so much for watching, and look out for more great Movie Flame videos on the way.